scientists who are working in the area of millets. So it will be more of a general discussion, and anything you have any queries, then you can please let me know. Yeah. So when we talk about International Year of Millets, and when we talk about millets and their role for sustainable developmental goals, we know that millets can contribute for zero hunger, good health and well-being because of their nutritional and therapeutic properties and functional properties. And most importantly, addressing climate action is told to be one of the important goals of sustainable developmental goals that can be addressed using millet crops. So let me give you an introduction about this climate change. We all know that when there is a change in weather pattern and when it lasts for extended period, so that is called climate change. Climate change has several direct, indirect effects. So when you talk about direct effects, it is nothing but the physiological changes, phenotypic changes, morphological changes that, ultimately affects the plant productivity. And the indirect effect includes changes in the soil fertility level, availability of irrigation, and increase in the pest and diseases, increase in the heat, high temperature levels, increase in the frequency of flood and drought intensities, and also rise in the sea level. So because of all these, it ultimately affects the socio-economics of the country. So when I'm talking about the contribution So when I'm talking about contribution of, greenhouse emission, the contribution by different sectors to the climate change and contribution of agriculture sector, especially to climate change in India, we can see that agriculture contributes 28% to the total GHG emissions. And among agriculture, rice cultivation alone contributes for 23% of GHG emissions. So there has been a rising temperature trend in India science since 1910, and there is almost 0.4 degree to now you can say almost 1.4 degree to 1.7 degree rise in temperature every year, which has been reported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And similarly, in the drought in India, you can say there has been greater percent of land area under drought stress in India in the last 2 decades. The frequency of drought in the past decades has increased more than 4 times in almost all the parts of the country. So, according to the UNICEF report, you can see that half of the world's population could be living in areas facing water scarcity. We can see that almost all parts of the world will have, almost physical water scarcity or economic water scarcity. So, we are in need of climate smart agriculture, so that we can establish food and nutritional security to the rising population. We need to have alternate cropping systems and newer varieties which are capable of withstanding extremes of weather conditions like long dry spells, that is drought conditions, flooding conditions, and varying moisture availability conditions. And those crops must also have the carbon sequestration ability in these changing climate effects. So, to ensure the food security of the global population, we need to diversify our grain production. So in order for that, we need to have some crops called climate compliant crops. So I think everybody is aware of this term called climate compliant crops. So those crops that can withstand high heat, low rainfall, drought, and which can survive under lesser use of inputs, and it can alleviate the malnutrition condition. So for all these conditions, millets are the best crop choice for climate resilient agriculture. So once these crops were called orphan crops, contingent crops, or underutilized crops, but now it has become the answer to all the above challenges. And realizing their climate resilient potential, along with their food security properties, it has been announced as the International Year of Millets. So moving on further, how millets can help. So millets grow easily in dry climate. So that is what when you talk of millets in terms of climate resilience, we can easily correlate that they are adapted to dry land and marginal environments. So they have a smaller harvesting period, that is, they have a very short life cycle, and they require minimal water quantity. Millets can sustain high temperatures, that is, they can grow in temperatures of up to 46 degrees Celsius, especially crops like pearl millet. and they have a very high drought tolerance capacity that allows the crop to be cultivated in adverse environmental conditions of many regions. So because of these nature, they are called the smart crops. So there are certain unique selling properties of these millet crops for planet, for farmers, and for human health. So when we talk about climate resilience for planet, it grows faster. As I told you, it has short life cycle. Almost all the crops, except Kodo millet, have a very short life cycle. They mature in 60 to 70 days. Many speakers would have talked about the duration of the millet crops, and they put less stress on environment because they themselves are adapted to those conditions, and they grow organically. Most people who grow the millet crops, they don't use any fertilizers, or they don't use any extra inputs for that. They require minimal fertilizer, and if at all, the pest attack is also very less in millets when compared to other major cereals. So they survive in low water and nutrient conditions, and they need less rainfall. So for farmers, they can withstand harsh environment, and they are resistant to pests and diseases, and they yield more. So when there is for example, when there is an intensity of drought, or there is a long dry spell of, when millets are cultivated under rain-fed conditions. Similarly, when you compare it with the case of rice, when there is a long spell of drought, you cannot have a good crop of the rice, but when millets will never fail. So that is why it is called as, resistant to, or which can withstand the harsh environments. And apart from just being climate resilient, they have very multiple uses also: food, feed, fodder, brewing, and biofuel, and thus ensuring sustainable source of income. So why millets have all these unique selling properties? Because they're anatomically and physiologically superior. So when you see the water requirement of millet crops when compared to other major crops, they have a minimum requirement of water like around 350 to 500 or 400 of rainfall. Just to share you one alarming thing, that 1 kg of paddy requires 3,000 to 4,000 liters of water, and every acre of paddy consumes 6 million liters of water. So you can imagine the water requirement by sugarcane and maize. Although they yield more, but they are very much water consuming. So in those conditions, millets can save a lot of water. So this statistics was not developed by us, but you can just see that a report by IRRI, it shows that irrigated rice requires a lot of water. About 3,000 to 5,000 liters of water are used to produce 1 kg of grain. So you can imagine the amount of water that is going in the major cereals. And globally also, this water requirement of these millet crops is very less. When you can just, across the country, you can see that the water requirement is very low for these millet crops. So in terms of both grain and fodder in the country, so cultivation of millets as rain-fed crops, like for example, 15 million hectare for grain and 3.8 million hectare for fodder crops, though multi-cut sorghum is grown only on 2 million hectares. With a mean water requirement of 350 to 450 by way of relying only on rainfall, we are saving almost 6.59 billion cubic meters of water for the country, which can be used in the other sectors. So millets are farmer and environment-friendly crops in terms of GHG emissions. Earlier slide showed that rice cultivation alone contributes for so much maximum GHG emissions among the agriculture sector. And you can see here that the CO2 emissions and non-CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions of the millet crops are very much less when compared to major cereals like maize, rice, and wheat. So among these, rice is the most energy intensive cereal, while millets are the least. So you can see not only they have low water footprint, but they also have a low carbon footprint. That is, when other crops like wheat and rice have the carbon footprint of 3,968 kg and 3,401 kg, the millet crops, this is the average of all the millet crops, which shows that they have a low carbon footprint of 3,218 kg equivalent of carbon dioxide per hectare. So when you can replace rice with other cereals, it has the potential to largely reduce the energy consumption and the greenhouse gas emissions. So ultimately, they are good for the planet because they have low water footprint, they have low to zero carbon footprint, and their energy footprint is also very minimal. So as I already mentioned, why they are anatomically and physiologically superior, they belong to the C4 group of plants. Almost many cultivated cereals belong to C3 crops. And millet crops, all the millet crops, including sorghum, pearl millet, and small millets, belong to the C4 crop of groups. And they belong to this pack-made clade. That is, evolutionarily, they belong to this pack-made clade. And when you compare the photosynthetic organelle of these millet crops, C4 photosynthesis, they have photosynthesis performing both in the mesophyll cells as well as in the bundle sheath cells. But in C3 crops, the photosynthesis occurs only in the mesophyll cells. And the first CO2 acceptor here is the rubisco, and it has a largely oxygenase activity. So this contributes for a lot of photorespiratory losses, but this is absent in case of C4 crops because whatever CO2 comes into the mesophyll cells is immediately fixed in the bundle sheath cells. And there is no movement for the CO2 to go externally. So there is zero or almost nil photorespiratory loss in the C4 crops. And not just one type, but these four C4 crops have almost 3 subtypes. So, and each of the millets have different subtypes of the C4 photosynthesis performing in their cells. So this is the anatomical difference. You can see that this shows the Oryza sativa, where C3 crop, this is an example of C3 crop, the chlorophyll pigments are present only in the mesophyll cells. Whereas here the chlorophyll cells are present, photosynthesis is active both in the bundle sheath cells as well as in the mesophyll cells. Even the vein density you can see for C3 crop, for example, when you take rice, the vein density is not as denser as in case of the Setaria varieties, that is foxtail millet and the sorghum. There are large number of longitudinal and latitudinal and translational veins that help in maximizing photoassimilation transport from one part of the leaf, that is from source to the other sink. So almost all the millets, when you compare the resilience and agronomic trait of millets, almost all the millets have drought tolerant ability and their water requirement is very less and their growing season length is also very less compared to other major cereals. So what we can do for, improving the sustainable agriculture. So millets are definitely the model crops for climate resilience because of their unique traits that I mentioned here. As I mentioned, their first CO2 acceptor, that is the phosphoenol pyruvate carboxylate, is largely CO2 accepting and not oxygen accepting. So this RUBP carboxylase has the role of to accept both CO2 as well as of oxygenase. So because of this condition, there is a lot of photorespiratory loss that is occurring in the crops. So this reduces the photosynthetic efficiency. And as I said, they have a Kranz anatomy, that is, they have dimorphic chloroplast, that is, the photosynthesis chlorophyll pigments are present both in the bundle sheath as well as in the mesophyll cells. So ultimately, the photosynthetic efficiency is higher in the C4 plants. And the CO2 compensation point is very less when compared to C3 plants. And the optimum temperature required for these C4 plants ranges from somewhere from 30 to 45 degrees Celsius. When you compare this 10 to 25 degrees Celsius, for C3 plants, it is 10 to 25 degrees Celsius. This means that any temperature or any rise in temperature more than this limit can severely affect the photosynthesis process. But the threshold for millet crops is very less, that is in general for C4 crops. But when we speak about millets, almost all the millet crops have a higher threshold for, higher temperature conditions. And the water use efficiency is also very much higher when compared to C3 crops. And as I already said, the transpiration ratio is also less when compared to these C4 plants. So how we can use these green millets to understand the C4 photosynthesis? I think you would have heard about this IRRI rice project, C4 rice project. which, has realized the potential of these C4 crops, and they had intended to transfer the C4 photosynthetic genes from millets into rice crops. And because of their efficient photosynthetic genes. So this C4 rice project was initiated from the wild relative of foxtail millet, that is green millet called Setaria viridis, and it has been proposed as the model organism for taking up the C4 rice project, that is transferring the important photosynthetic genes from the C4 viridis crop, that is Setaria viridis crop, into the C3 plant. So what are the important traits for consideration of these millet crop is that they have a very short life cycle, as I already mentioned, and they have a very short stature, and they have a very small leaf area, and they are very source sink efficient, and and as I said, because they have very efficient leaf venation features, and they have deeper root system, and they are very hardy to stress conditions. So these all traits make them powerful model system for dissecting the C4 photosynthesis. So what are the key traits in millet crops? When any stress or abiotic stress condition occurs, you can see that a millet crop will have earliness. That is, it will have the rapid phenological advancement, which means it will have an early life cycle completion to cope up with that stress condition. So they have earliness, they have plasticity to flower as per the pattern of rainfall condition, which you cannot observe in other major cereals. Usually other major cereals like rice and wheat have a lot of pollen infertility, and will have a lot of problem in flowering and seed setting, which can be which is very much avoided in these millet crops. And they have since they have a smaller leaf area, and they have waxy leaves, and they have better leaf venation, which contributes for higher photo assimilation, transpiration efficiency, and water use efficiency. They have early, dense, and deep root system with high water uptake efficiency. Usually, where many millets are grown under rain-fed conditions, so whatever the residual moisture is there, or whatever the rain-fed condition, whatever the rainfall pattern occurs, millet can yield better under those conditions. And due to their anatomical and physiological superiority, they have higher photosynthesis, they have many higher functional genes, that is better functional genes, that are expressed under abiotic stress conditions. So now we may have a question that with these many unique traits, why do we need to study for abiotic stress tolerance in millet crops? That is a natural question that occurs with all of us. When we say millets are adaptable to hardy and marginal environments, they are suited to climate, less input conditions, they don't require much conditions. But my answer is like, although they're adapted to marginal or dryland environments, in order to achieve the yield potential, you need to give optimum inputs. So be it their agroecological condition inputs. I'm telling about the inputs, like be it the agroecological condition, or the irrigation, optimum irrigation, or the minimal fertilizer input, or the use of improved cultivars. So without achieving the yield potential, we cannot aim of improving the productivity as a whole. And whatever the farmers that grow, like for example, a farmer prefers his own variety or a land trace. So they may have all the traits. They may have the plasticity, they may be adapted, even with 1 or 2 rains, they can give a good yield. But as you have to, but it cannot have it cannot improve the productivity of that crop as a whole. So without proper grain yield, and when you have an yield compensation under these stress conditions, it becomes a major problem. So the climate change effect is too much that the frequency of the drought, the frequency of the high temperature condition, everything occurs. Even millet crops suffer the abiotic stress effects. For example, low temperature hinders the seedling germination, especially in Rabi sorghum. And high temperature, it affects the seedling establishment, seedling germination of pearl millet. So, and likewise salinity and drought. And some improved crop varieties have photosensitivity problem and issues. That means they cannot perform well when they are sown in the off-season conditions. So there is a holistic approach required to improve the traits of these, millet crops. So we need to have abiotic stress tolerance in our improved varieties. So what can be done? is like we can go for exploitation and trait specific utilization of these germplasm. We have a large germplasm which is available for millets for almost all the crops, and we need to dissect out those traits and use genomic approaches to support the breeding programs. So, as last speaker mentioned, Dr. Parshuram sir was mentioning, they have many breeding programs for specific traits. And among those specific traits, even though we have improved cultivars, ultimately we need to share the improved cultivar or the good seed to the farmer so that he can, realize better yields and he can have better productivity and he can have sufficient income with these millet crops. So on that case, you need to, when a variety goes for, specific agroecological conditions, or when a variety is released for different agroecological conditions, or at least say rain-fed condition, it must also have the abiotic stress tolerant property so that you can have, better yield without having major yield compensation during this stress conditions. And we need to harness the positive improvements under climate change effects. So for improving the desirable traits, so in our millet crop, we need to have we need to improve the millets as a holistic approach. For what are the superior millet traits? So what are the traits that are required for improved agronomical conditions, and what are the nutritional traits that need to be improved, and what are the domestication traits? For example, it may be a high yielding variety, but it may be susceptible to lodging during flooding conditions, and it may have seed shattering, and the seed size may not be that optimum to have the proper test weight. The harvest index may not be, good for that crop. And when you're selecting millet crops for dual purposes, for example, food as well as for fodder crop, you need to have good biomass, and you need to have good productive tillers. And when you need to have drought tolerance, you need to have many traits. And even though they are rescue crops, we need to have better grain filling period so that we can have better yield. So you need to develop a kind of idiotype or in the improved cultivars that can sustain across the ecologies. So climate resilience will include improving the climate resilience in millets will include all the components: modeling, physiology, and genomics. So I would just take one case study where pearl millet was compared with the wheat crop under severe drought conditions. You can see that the drought responsive genes were more in the pearl millet crop when compared to the wheat crop. So these kind of upregulated genes that are having better effects under drought stress conditions can be transferred to the C3 crops, or maybe transferred from the land racers or the available gene pool to the improved cultivar. So that is why the breeding population is developed for a specific trait, for example, for a drought condition or a flooding condition or for a high temperature tolerance. And when these pearl millet and wheat leaves were subjected to drought under severe drought conditions, you can see that the proteome of the genes or the proteome expressed in different tissues were very much higher in the pearl millet when compared to the wheat. So this also gives an opportunity for us to look for genes that can be transferred to other cereal crop species to make them climate resilient or abiotic stress tolerant. And when I told this point, you would have seen here harnessing the positive improvements under climate change effects. We know that C3 crops cannot sustain more under the elevated CO2 conditions, but in C4 crops, like especially pearl millet, sorghum, where their CO2 compensation point is very less. So we can know that the elevated temperature, when there is elevated temperature and the CO2 effect, under elevated CO2 conditions, you can see that there was improvement in the protein content, there was improvement in the fodder and grain quality content. So the climate change effects, although may be deteriorative, it may also have a positive side also. So we need to look into these positive sides so that they can explore these millet crops for different agroecologies or different environmental conditions or hotspot conditions. So what we do at IIMR is we do phenotyping for evaluating the water use efficient genotypes or stress tolerant genotypes using lysimeters. Why water use efficiency? Because higher the water use efficiency. Let me first tell you, crop water use efficiency is the amount of carbon as biomass or grain that is produced per unit of water used by the crop. So when you can screen or select for better water use efficient crops, they will definitely have higher transpiration efficiency, which means they are drought tolerant. I'm telling this as an example for drought tolerance. Likewise, we can develop phenotyping protocols for various abiotic stress conditions, because ultimately yield is what water is used and how much biomass is accumulated in the plant. So this particular facility, lysimeter facility exists at IIMR. So these lysimeters can complement other phenotyping activities both in the field and in control environments. And they are primarily used to harness the root systems to improve drought adaptation of crops, because we precisely collect the water consumption quantities and timings, and we correlate it to the agronomical data, that is grain yield. And it also provides information on key traits that contribute for yield increase, including the stress tolerance of these crops. So we can measure water extraction at critical crop stages. So this is what we can, with the available germplasm and with the available germplasm material or gene pool available with us, we can screen for high water use efficient crops, which can be, incorporated or introgressed into our improved cultivars. So thanks for the attention. So any doubts you have, you can just let me know. Thank you. Sir?
Yeah, thank you, madam, for